The recipe is not a recipe. That is the first thing to get straight, because it changes everything that follows. What carried mountain families from October to April was not a dish somebody wrote down. It was a plant, a specific squash, bred deliberately over generations by specific people, selected for one trait above all others. Not flavor, not size, not yield. It was selected to sit in a loft for 8 months and get better. That squash has a name, it has an origin, and both of them are more interesting than any pie. It was developed by the Cherokee in the southern Appalachians in the 1800s. It was not documented outside the Cherokee Nation until 1925. Its seeds are today held in a tribal seed bank because the variety came close enough to disappearing that somebody had to go and save it. And here is the part that will actually be useful to you. There is one way of putting up pumpkin that people are enthusiastically doing right now, in home kitchens, that the United States Department of Agriculture explicitly tells you not to do. It is the most popular pumpkin preserve in America. It is the one thing on the entire list that can kill you. And the government's own canning guide contains a one-word instruction, in capitals, about it. We will get to that, and it is the most practically useful 90 seconds in this video. First, the pumpkin, which is not a pumpkin. Then how it kept. Then what they actually made. Then why it mattered more than anything else in that loft. And then what was nearly lost. Picture the thing on an American porch every October. Round, orange, hollow, thin-walled, watery, and, if you have ever tried to cook one, largely tasteless. That is a field pumpkin. It is bred to be carved. It is essentially a decoration with a stem. That is not what was hanging in a mountain loft. The mountain crop was winter squash, mostly Cucurbita maxima, rather than the pepo species of the jack-o'-lantern. Thick-walled, dense-fleshed, heavy, grown for one purpose, which was to be eaten in February. And the flagship of them, the one that belongs to these mountains specifically, is the candy roaster. It looks nothing like a pumpkin. It is long and curved, sometimes called a banana squash for that reason, and it comes in an improbable range of colors: pink, tan, orange, gray, green, even blue. A common one runs 10 to 15 pounds. The record specimens are far larger than that. Its history is reasonably well documented, though researchers who work on it note that the earliest part is hazy. And what is not in dispute is that it belongs to the Cherokee Nation. The candy roaster was bred by Cherokee growers in the 1800s across what is now western North Carolina, North Georgia, and East Tennessee. It was valued, in the plainest terms, for 2 things. It would take a frost, and it would keep for months. The first known appearance of it outside the Cherokee community was a 1925 newspaper article in the Charlotte Observer, describing an Indian fair at the Cherokee school where seed was made available to people who applied for it through the Chamber of Commerce. That is the moment it entered settler kitchens at scale, 1925. Which means, when people describe candy roaster pie as an old Appalachian Thanksgiving tradition, the tradition in the mountains generally is old, and the wide distribution of this particular squash to non-Cherokee households is about a century old and traceable to a specific event. It is not the only one. Cushaw, the crook-necked green and white striped squash of the upland south, is the other great mountain keeper, and it turns up in the same lofts and the same recipes. Cushaw has its own advantage worth noting. It is notably resistant to the squash vine borer. the pest that destroys more home squash plantings than anything else, which is precisely the kind of trait a family, depending on the crop, would have noticed and selected for. Now here is the part that should reframe the whole video. The candy roaster is not a wild plant somebody found. It is not a happy accident. It is the output of a breeding program, one run without laboratories, without written records, and without the word genetics, across generations, by people selecting seed year after year for the traits they needed. Because these squashes cross-pollinate readily, more than 40 distinct named strains are recognized, and keeping any one of them true requires deliberate isolation. Somebody had to be paying that kind of attention on purpose for a very long time, selecting seed from the fruit that kept longest, not the one that tasted best in September, rejecting the plants that produced beautifully and rotted by Christmas, doing that again the next year and the next, and passing the seed and the reasoning to somebody younger. And what they were selecting for was not taste. Taste came along for the ride. They were selecting for time. Look at everything else in a mountain winter larder and notice how much work each item represents. The hog, killed in the cold, cut up, salted, packed, smoked over days. The beans, strung on thread, hung, dried, sacked. The kraut, shredded, salted, weighted, fermented for weeks. The apples, sliced, sulfured, dried on scaffolds. The corn, harvested, shucked, shelled, dried, hauled to the mill. Every single one of those is a process. Everyone costs labor at the busiest time of year, and everyone can fail. Now the winter squash. You cut it off the vine. You leave it to cure for a week or two in a warm, dry place, which hardens the rind and seals over any small wounds. Then you put it on a shelf. That is the entire preservation method. No salt, no smoke, no fermentation, no jar, no fire, no spring, no cellar, no crock, no weights, no watching. A properly cured winter squash with an intact hard rind and a bit of stem will hold for months at ordinary indoor temperatures. And the conditions it wants are not the cold, damp cellar the potatoes need, but a cool, dry spot, which in a mountain house meant the loft, the back room, or under a bed. The plant does the work. The rind is the container. That is the whole technology, and it is worth sitting with how unusual that is. Almost every preservation method humans have invented works by making food inhospitable, too salty, too acidic, too dry, too cold. The winter squash needs none of that because it arrives already sealed. Nature packaged it, and then it does something better than merely surviving. Winter squash improves in storage. This is not folklore. The candy roaster is specifically prized for reaching its best flavor after several months, and there is measurable chemistry behind it. Research on stored winter squash found total glucose content in the flesh rising sharply during storage, with a substantial increase by the second month. Starch converts toward sugar. Texture changes. The flesh goes from bland and watery to dense and genuinely sweet. Sweet enough that recipes using candy roasters traditionally call for no added sugar at all. Think about what that means for a household with no refrigeration and no cash. Every other food in that house is in a slow race against decay, and the cook's job is to slow it down. The squash is the one item on the shelf that is quietly getting better the longer nobody touches it. In January, when the apples have gone soft and the cabbage is spent and the smokehouse is thinning, the squash in the loft is at its peak. It is the only food in the building that rewards patience instead of punishing it. And there is a second-order consequence worth naming. Because the squash keeps itself, it frees up something scarcer than shelf space: the cook's hours. Every day spent salting, stringing, drying, or fermenting is a day not spent on something else, in a season already crowded with slaughtering and harvest. A crop that preserves itself is not just food. It is time given back to a household that had none to spare. So why would anyone go to the trouble of processing it at all? Two reasons: space and insurance. And that is where the actual recipe comes in. Here is the method as it was done. Before the hard frost, the crop comes in. The best-formed, cleanest, hard-rinded fruits with the stems intact go on the shelf whole, to be eaten across the winter. Anything with a bruise, a soft spot, a broken stem, or a rind that did not harden properly will not keep. So those get processed immediately, because a squash that is going to fail will fail on your shelf and take its neighbors with it. That is the sorting decision, and it is the real skill. It is also the reason the dried rings existed at all. Drying was not the preferred method. Drying was what you did with the fruit that could not be trusted to keep. The best squash never got processed. It just sat there, being squash, until somebody was hungry. The processing itself is drying, and the form is specific and distinctive. Rings. Cut the squash crosswise into rings roughly an inch thick. Scrape out the seeds. Those get set aside because they are food too, and some of them are next year's crop. Peel. Then hang the rings over a stick, a pole, or a length of broom handle suspended in a dry place. A loft, a back room, over the fireplace. Then wait and turn them, and wait more until they are leathery and dry through. Thinner rings dry faster and more evenly, which matters, because a ring that is dry on the outside and still damp at the core will mold in the sack and take the rest with it. And where the drying happened over a fire, a second thing came free with it: smoke. Documentation of Southeastern practice notes that pumpkin rings strung and hung in the smoky upper part of a dwelling dried and smoked together. And the smoke is doing real work, because it discourages the mildew that is the main enemy of drying anything in a humid mountain autumn. The dried rings go into cloth or paper sacks and sit alongside the corn and the beans in the back room, taking up a fraction of the space the whole fruit would have needed. That is the storage form. Now cooking. Through the winter, rings are broken into pieces and soaked overnight, then boiled soft, and from that point they behave like fresh squash, into a soup, into a stew, into cornbread, simmered down long and slow with sorghum or molasses into pumpkin butter, thick, dark, spiced, spread on a biscuit. Into pie, which in these mountains was as often candy roaster as anything else, and needed no sugar because the storage had already done that. And people who ate it are consistent on one point: dried pumpkin does not taste the same as fresh. It is deeper, more concentrated, slightly caramelized. Like the leather breeches beans hanging next to it, the drying is not just preservation. It is a transformation into a different food. Nothing was wasted. The seeds were roasted and eaten or saved for planting. And pumpkin seeds are a genuinely good food in their own right, dense in fat, protein, magnesium and zinc, which is not a trivial addition to a winter diet. Whole squash could be set near the fire and turned until the flesh went soft, which is about as simple as cooking gets. Hollow dried shells served as containers, and anything past eating went to the cows and the hogs, which is why 19th century farm writing praises pumpkins as stock feed as warmly as it praises them as food. One crop, no inputs, feeds the family, feeds the animals, plants itself next year. But none of that is the reason this mattered most. The reason is something nobody in that house could see, taste, or name. Take an honest inventory of a mountain plate in February. Cornbread, salt pork, dried beans, potatoes, maybe kraut, maybe some dried apples, coffee if there is money. Now ask what that diet is short of. Not calories, there are plenty of those. The question is, what is missing that the body cannot manufacture and cannot store indefinitely? It has protein if the beans hold out. It has some fiber and minerals. What it is structurally missing, and the gap widens with every week since the last green thing grew, is vitamin A. Vitamin A is not optional, and it is not subtle. It is required for vision in low light. Deficiency produces night blindness first, and in severe prolonged cases progresses to xerophthalmia, drying of the eye that can end in blindness. It is also required for immune function, and deficient people are markedly more susceptible to infection. Historically, it is the classic deficiency of populations living on a narrow, starchy staple with little else. And a winter of cornmeal and fatback is exactly that shape of diet. Now look at what is hanging in the loft. Winter squash and pumpkin are among the densest sources of beta-carotene available anywhere. The plant compound the body converts into vitamin A. It is the reason for the color. The deeper the orange, the more carotene. Research on winter squash found carotene content highest in the most mature fruit, which is precisely the fruit that was harvested for storage. And then two details that turn this from a nice fact into an actual system. First, the timing. Almost everything else that could supply vitamin A in this diet is seasonal and gone by winter. The greens are finished. There is nothing fresh. The squash is the one high carotene food in the house that is designed to still be there in February, the month the deficit would otherwise be deepest. Second, the fat. Beta-carotene is fat-soluble. Your body absorbs it far better when it arrives with some fat. And what is the squash being cooked with in every one of these households? Pork, lard, butter. The salt pork and lard cooking that gets treated as a mark of a poor diet is, in this specific case, the thing that makes the vitamin in the squash actually available. Nobody planned that. Nobody could have. Vitamin A was not identified until the 20th century, and beta-carotene's role as its precursor came later still. What these households had instead was several centuries of observation, of which children thrived through a winter, and which did not of what people ate in the households that came through well, compressed into a set of habits that nobody could justify and everybody followed. But this is the third sister. Remember the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, grown together in one system. Corn gives energy and a pole. Beans give lysine and nitrogen for the soil. And squash gives ground cover, moisture retention, weed suppression. And on the plate, the one nutrient the other two cannot supply. 3 crops, 1 field. Between them they cover carbohydrate, complete protein, and vitamin A, and one of the 3 keeps for 8 months without being touched. That is not a folk tradition. That is a food system, and it was solved on this continent thousands of years before anyone could explain a single step of it. So how did the region that had all of this end up nearly losing it? Two separate losses, and one of them is still happening in kitchens right now. The first loss is the seed. The candy roaster came close to going. Its cultivation declined significantly through the 20th century with the collapse of small family farming in the mountains and everything that displaced it. The variety is now listed in Slow Food's Ark of Taste, and the Cherokee Nation maintains candy roaster seed in a tribal seed bank through its Natural Resources Department. Specifically so, the variety does not go extinct. And the reason it is fragile is a lovely piece of irony. This squash is easy to grow and generous, and that is the problem. It is open-pollinated and crosses readily with other squashes, which is why more than 40 strains exist. Keep it near other varieties and you do not get a candy roaster next year, you get something else. Holding a variety true requires isolation, deliberate seed selection, and somebody who knows why they are bothering. Which means the plant does not survive on its own. It survives only as long as the practice survives, as long as there are people saving seed on purpose. The generosity that made it spread is exactly what makes it dissolve when nobody is paying attention. The second loss is the knowledge, and this one is not historical at all. It is happening this autumn. Look at how modern people preserve pumpkin. Almost nobody dries rings on a pole. What they do is make pumpkin butter or puree and put it in jars on a shelf. The USDA's position on this is unambiguous, and it has been for decades. Home canning is not recommended for pumpkin butter or for any mashed or pureed pumpkin or winter squash. The only tested directions in the USDA's Complete Guide to Home Canning are for cubed flesh, pressure canned. And the directions for preparing it carry an explicit instruction. Caution: do not mash or puree. Two things are wrong with a jar of pumpkin butter, and they stack. Acidity. Pumpkin is a low-acid food. Recipes typically add lemon juice or vinegar to try to push the pH below 4.6, the threshold under which Clostridium botulinum cannot grow. Research at the University of Missouri tested pumpkin butters made by home canners and small producers and found the pH varied enormously between batches made from the same recipe, with some readings as high as 5.4, well above the safe line. Later testing elsewhere found the same variability. You cannot reliably acidify a puree of a vegetable whose own composition changes with variety, maturity, and, as we established in Chapter 2, how long it has been sitting in storage. Viscosity. The second problem is physics. A thick puree does not convect. Heat cannot move through it the way it moves through liquid. So the center of the jar never reaches the temperature the outside does. Even in a pressure canner, the middle of a jar of pumpkin butter may not get hot enough for long enough to destroy botulinum spores. Low acid, plus a texture that blocks heat, plus an airtight jar at room temperature. That is every condition the organism needs, delivered together in the most appealing package possible. And note what this means about the historical method. Drying was safe. Take the water out and nothing grows. No acid required, no seal required, no thermometer, no equipment, no failure mode that hides. The whole storage was safe because a squash that goes bad announces it immediately. It softens, it weeps, it smells, and you throw it out. The old ways were self-policing. The modern shortcut is not, and it is the modern shortcut, not the old method, that carries the risk. So, the recipe that got mountain families through winter. It was not a pie. It was a squash bred by Cherokee growers over generations to survive a frost and sweeten in a loft, hung in rings over a stick above a smoky fire, sacked and soaked back to life in the coldest month of the year. Carrying, though nobody could have told you so, the one nutrient the rest of that winter table could not provide. It cost nothing. It stored itself. It fed the people, then the animals, and then it planted next year's crop out of its own seeds. There is no other item in that entire winter larder you can say all four of those things about. You can still buy candy roaster seed. Southern Exposure and others carry it, and Cherokee growers and Appalachian farmers are actively bringing it back, at markets and on menus across western North Carolina. The recipe was never written down because the recipe was never the point. The recipe was the seed. And unlike almost everything else in this story, that part is recoverable, because a group of people looked at what was disappearing and put it in a bank.